On the 30th of July 2008, Tim McLean was travelling home after working away, but little did he know he would never make it home. I'm calling Colby, and this video is episode 1 of my new series, Crazy Cases. And this episode covers the tragic murder of Tim McLean. The following case may not be suitable for some people. It does include beheading, cannibalism, mentions of mental health, especially schizophrenia. Everything said in this video is researched by myself, and if anything is incorrect, I do apologise for that. I try my best to research things as well as I can, but I am just one person. As well as that, every opinion stated in this video is my own opinion. So let's get on with the case. Timothy Richard McLean, known as Tim, was born on the 3rd of October 1985. He grew up in Winnipeg and Ely in Canada. I apologise if I'm not saying any of these places' names correct. I'm British. I apologise. I couldn't find much on his childhood and his upbringing other than his parents were divorced and he had a brother. People who knew Tim described him as incredibly charismatic. He could walk into a room and immediately catch everyone's attention. Alongside this, he hated working. He would start a job, get bored of it after he'd met everyone he could, and he'd just leave. Which is fair enough, wanting to meet people. And he just kept doing this until he was offered a job working for a fair, travelling around, meeting people, getting to travel with the people that they've met, making friends, you know? It sounds fun, sounds good. Then on July 30th, 2008, Tim was travelling home. He left the carnival and got on a bus towards Winnipeg. The tall man in his 40s got on the bus a few stops after Tim had gotten on the bus. This man was a man named Vince Lee. Vince was born in Dandong in China on April 30th, 1968. He was born a month premature, which led to many issues with him growing up. He wasn't able to walk or talk until he was 5. But this by no means meant he wasn't smart. At the age of 19, he started studying automotive engineering and proceeded to graduate from this with a bachelor's degree in computing. He worked in Beijing for a few years before immigrating into Canada on June 11th, 2001 with his wife. In the autumn of 2004, Vince began working in Winnipeg, Canada, at a Great Memorial Church. He worked here for 6 months, but whilst working here, he said that he converted himself to Christianity. He claims to have heard the voice of God and saw God, and this just made him want to convert. But what he believed to be the voice of God told him that the second coming of Jesus was going to come, and Jesus was coming to protect us humans from an alien invasion. Because this could take place any day, Vince started carrying around a buck knife for protection. Vince would often go days without eating or sleeping, crying to his wife, complaining about the visions he was seeing, the voices he was hearing, convinced that they were God. In June 2008, Vince's mental health started getting worse. On July 24th, he left his now ex-wife. I couldn't find the date where they divorced, but at this point, she is his ex-wife. They're still living together, but they aren't together. But on July 24th, he left his ex-wife a note asking her to not go looking for him, and he wishes she was happy. He would often, in the past, go on walks and not be home for days. He'd take bus journeys and not be home for days, claiming that it's because God was telling him to. But because of this, his ex-wife wasn't concerned by the note. She just assumed he'd be back in a few days like he always was. Now going back to July 30th, 2008, Vince boarded the bus a few stops after Tim. Vince originally sat at the front of the bus, whilst Tim was sat at the rear up against the window. After a pit stop, Vince decided to head to the rear of the bus and sit next to Vince. Tim took no notice of Vince. He just simply put his headphones on, shut his eyes, head up against the window and went to sleep. But not long after he had fallen asleep, Vince pulled out his buck knife that he carried with him for protection from these aliens and viciously started stabbing Tim in the neck and in the chest. The driver immediately saw what was happening and pulled over on the side of the road. The driver and the passengers all fled out of the bus, fearing their lives. The driver and two men tried to pull Tim away from Vince, but Vince chased them to the door, swinging his knife at them, but the door's shut and he was just swinging his knife at us. After this, Vince immediately ran back to Tim's body. Tim was still awake. He was aware of what was going on. He just didn't understand. Well, he couldn't understand why this stranger sat on the bus next to him just decided to hurt him. But what Vince did next is extremely disturbing. With his buck knife, Vince decapitated Tim, picking up his head, walking over to the window where all the passengers were stood outside, and held up Tim's head, almost as if he was showing off to the passengers outside like they were his audience. After holding up this head to the window, he returned back to Tim's body, started cutting off different parts of his body, his arms, his legs, his nose, his ears, his eyes, his tongue. And witnesses say that they saw him start to eat bits of Tim's flesh. This reportedly went on for hours. Hours of Vince cutting up Tim and eating bits of him. A truck driver who was simply just driving by saw the commotion of all these passengers on this bus, stood outside, not knowing what was going on. He pulled over to see what was going on. Someone in the crowd of the witnesses explained to the truck driver what was happening, and the truck driver went to his truck, got a crowbar and a hammer, and armed himself and one of the witnesses in case Vince managed to get out of this bus and came for one of them. But what I forgot to mention was as the driver got off the bus, he triggered a button which made the bus inoperable. The doors couldn't be opened from the inside, the engine wouldn't be able to start, Vince would not be able to get away. But Vince wasn't aware of this. After several hours had gone by, he tried to flee the scene. He got into the driver's seat and tried to drive away, but it didn't work. At 9 p.m, the police called in negotiators and armed officers. The negotiators were trying to talk Vince into getting off this bus and handing himself in, obviously going about this with extreme caution because they didn't know if he had a gun, they didn't know what else he was capable of doing. While the negotiators were trying to talk to him, he was just pacing up and down the bus. Vince then stated that he had to stay on this bus forever and started eating more of Tim's body. A few hours later, at 1:30 a.m, Vince tried to escape. He broke a window and jumped out. Because of this, the police tasered him twice, put him in handcuffs and took him to the station. When the police were clearing up the crime scene, they couldn't find certain parts of Tim. They assumed that because they'd seen Vince eating him, maybe he'd eaten the bits that they couldn't find. But once they'd gotten to the station, they had to search Vince. Of course they did. What if he had another weapon on him? They found Tim's ears, nose and tongue, all in Vince's pocket. But the other part they could not find was part of Tim's heart and his eyes. But Vince claims to have not eaten those parts. I believe he admitted to eating other parts, but he refused to admit that he ate those two specific parts, but the police still assumed that he ate them because where else would they have gone? He had been seen eating them. Something that was shocking was one of the witnesses reported to police that whilst this attack was happening, Vince didn't seem to have any emotion. It was like watching a robot stabbing, like he just had no emotion. But during the trial, it was discovered by a psychiatrist and Vince's lawyers that Vince was schizophrenic. Part of them coming to this conclusion was because Vince claimed that as he got on the bus, he was told by God that he needs to kill someone. If he didn't kill the man sitting next to him, he himself was going to die. The conclusion of this trial was that Vince was deemed too mentally unill to go to prison. So instead, he was sent to a high-security psychiatric hospital where he would undergo treatment. In 2010, he was allowed supervised walks on the hospital's grounds. This then led to, in 2011, Vince's psychiatrist requesting that he be allowed more freedoms. He then began to have supervised visits to the community, going into town, looking around shops, walks in the park, on the beach. This then progressed to Vince being allowed unsupervised time out, until eventually, on February 10th, 2017, he would be allowed to be set free. He was allowed to just move back into society. He had no restrictions on to living independently. He was just allowed to go live a normal life. I'm interested in your guys' opinions on this case, because a lot of criminals try to deem themselves as mentally insane, but in this case, I think Vince generally was. There's all the stuff with his ex-wife and everything, but I'm interested in your thoughts and theories about this case. So please drop a comment below with any thoughts, feelings, or whatever you have to say about this case. And if you did enjoy this case and you'd like to see more videos like it, consider subscribing. I'm starting a series called Crazy Cases, where every couple of weeks we are going to cover a different case. Any cases you'd like to see me cover, please let me know. With all that being said, I'll see you guys next week.